Where it might be where you say like you said I'm not low and then say trying to say yeah by them. And then so like we're trying to volunteering. I'm like, oh my god, I know I have done I don't know like yeah. I did it. And then I yeah. And it was like you're writing so like it's yeah. I just want to really know.
I wanted to say like top of the morning to you or something. So you have I know, I had my for like the end without grade. We need to start. How is everybody? Yeah. Can you feel that spring break? I can feel your energy that spring break is next week.
So excited.
I know. Great. Is anyone going anywhere fun for spring break?
I'm working on making money as well. Oh, wow.
That's a London. I want to go to London. We're going to San Diego.
Wait, I have the best bakery to send you to.
Okay.
I went there 3 times.
By all means, let me know. All right, so we have a couple of things to finish up, right? I want to talk about our guest speaker. We'll jump back into this, of course. I was thinking about St. Patrick's Day. We had to like mess up our house last night because 2 of our kids still believe in all of the magical things. I think they know, but they don't want to tell us that they know, and so we just keep doing everything. Like we built a trap for to catch our leprechaun's name is Patches O'Houlihan, right? And he made a huge mess in our house last night, right? But I want to talk first about the guest speaker, right? So I appreciate that so many of you were here for the QPR speaker that we had. So between us, right, this doesn't have to leave our room, but what did you think? Was it helpful, not helpful? Were any kind of like reactions or feedback to our guests? Speakers, nothing at all? Yeah.
I think it was great.
Yeah.
And I mean, and to learn that it's okay to check on other people, that it does more good than harm. Because I think in my mind, I always thought, am I overstepping boundaries? Am I getting to, my personal or, or could it cause them to do it and not, so that it helped to answer some of those myths.
Okay. Good.
That was really helpful.
And that's a really big one, right? That if you ask somebody, you'll like plant the idea in their mind, right? And if somebody's suicidal, they've had the idea, right? So that's, I wouldn't say it's impossible, but it's really unlikely that that would be the case, right? And I know role plays are the worst. They're so awkward, right? But I appreciate all of you doing it anyway and doing the best that you can with them. I always hated role plays. I'll be like, oh no, do we have to? It only gets worse if you go on in psychology, just to say that you do a lot of role plays, especially in like a therapy program, but they're helpful, as awkward as they can be. Any other like thoughts? Any other pieces of feedback or reactions? Anything they had to say? Yeah.
I didn't realize what was to say.
Yeah.
That was really
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just to say it, right? And I imagine a lot of you have known somebody who's suicidal or, has harmed themselves or maybe even has completed suicide. It's sadly something that's really common. It correlates very strongly with the mood disorders that we're covering. And it's scary every time. I can tell you when I was a therapist, this was the scariest part about being a therapist, when people were deeply suicidal. And we'd have them sign like no suicide contracts. And that sounds so silly, but they would sign a contract saying, I won't like kill myself until I see this. And that sometimes was enough to get them through. But more than anything about being a therapist, I would lose sleep about clients who were suicidal because I worried about them. Like I worried that they would do something over the weekend. But till I saw them next, I mean, it can be a really scary thing, personally or professionally. And they talked about this as well, but it's a very like permanent solution to something very temporary. But when we're depressed, we don't think clearly. Like our mind is so fogged that it can be very simple to be like, I just want to feel different. I just want to get out of this state. And people consider something like suicide, even though, you know, typically moods will lift at some point. It can be a very like challenging thing to get out of that kind of state. Any other like comments or anything else? I'm not going to cover chapter 7 because they kind of went over some of that. So make sure that you look through the slides. Make sure you know what QPR stands for the next exam. That's kind of the one thing that I'll probably ask you. And I would really, really encourage you to put that little QPR training on any application or resume that you turn in for something. If you're applying to a graduate school, if you're applying to transfer, if you're applying for a psychology job, put it on, right? Anything that you can do to help yourself stand out. And that's a big one. Right, I know it's like only an hour training, but you do get that little certificate and it's something you can put on a resume. Right, so again, make sure you look over this one, yeah. But it is something that you can still put on there. As a side note, and like obviously we're gonna get back to mood disorders, but something that's really common here, and they didn't talk about it at all, but there's something called tip skills. And like emergency self-care plans and like how to shift your mood. So from a cognitive behavioral standpoint, cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT, they often talk about things like tip skills as something when people are suicidal or in a really, really desperate state. And TIP stands for a couple of things. It's like temperature, intensity, like you can change your state is the idea, right? So it's things like intense exercise, maybe causing the state change or something in some way. Temperature, they talk about putting your hands or even your face in freezing water as a way to jolt your nervous system out of that state. Extreme exercise for a matter of moments, right? It's just kind of like this idea of shifting you out of a state of emergency into a neutral or different state. And it's kind of interesting. I used to think this was kind of silly, but if you're ever feeling like really, really, really down, like run for a minute, do 15 jumping jacks, jump rope for a minute, like something intense like that will actually pull you out of that state, even if it's just temporary. Or sticking your head or your hands or something like that in something really cold, it will jolt your nervous system out. And so it's something that we sometimes talk about with people as a way to pull yourself out of this state, even if it's just kind of in the short term. So just something I wanted to mention. It's kind of like an emergency self-care plan that we sometimes talk about, especially in therapy. So again, look over these slides, read through that chapter. And if you weren't here last time, it was recorded, so you can go back and watch it. I know a few of you had messaged me about it being a little sensitive. So make sure you go back and watch it if you weren't. Otherwise, we'll get back into our mood disorders. And we got a good way through this, right? We talked a lot about depression. We focused on depression mainly, and you made me so proud last time, right? They emailed me later and they were like, your class did so well. And I was like, I'm proud of them, right? I felt very proud of all of you, like a proud parent up here. It's because of the Bella clip, wasn't it? Right. My kids were like, you really showed that? I'm like, uh-huh. So anyway, but we talked about treatments and causes, a lot of biological stuff. So we spent a lot of time here talking about these different medications. And then we talked about some of these other treatments for treatment-resistant depression. And then we also talked about ketamine as well. So any other thoughts or comments here before we move forward? Yeah.
I just, having too much serotonin at one point in our lecture, last or the second to last one. What does that kind of do to your body? And like what kind of what's like physical effects of it?
Yeah, so when people are flooded with serotonin, and I think I mentioned this at one point, you can get something called serotonin syndrome. If you have too much serotonin, it can actually be fatal. It drives your blood pressure way up. It can cause you to hallucinate. It can cause you to have seizures or strokes if it goes high enough. So too much serotonin can be very, very dangerous. And sometimes those SSRIs or SNRIs can interact with other medications to drive that up as well. So it's really important to monitor you know, if you're on one of those medications, you're typically monitored pretty intensely in the beginning, and then it sort of tapers off the longer you've been on it. Yeah. Anything else for the moment? Anything else for now? So I was talking with a couple of people in here about this comedian that I really love. Like I had shared it with you, right? And a couple other people. I don't know if you've heard of Taylor Tomlinson, probably one of my favorite comedians, because she has this whole bit that's related to depression, antidepressants, and bipolar disorder. So she has bipolar, which is something we're going to talk about a lot today. And I thought it was kind of a cool connection to the SSRIs that we were talking about. So I watched the whole thing again over the weekend, and there's like a little like 8-minute clip that I want to play for you. And I think it gets at a lot of the stereotypes of depression and some cultural things too. Like we were joking about, like her dad just says, just eat some peanut butter and you'll feel better, right? And that's like a really common mentality of just pull yourself up, get over it, move on. There was an old comedian that used to say, just stop it, right? Just stop, right? And move on. And so I want to play this for you. And I think it's kind of a nice segue as well into what we'll talk about the rest of the day today, which is bipolar disorder. So I'm only going to play a section of it, but it's all about like being on SSRIs and medications, and then stigma and bipolar disorder. So I thought it was kind of fitting of where we're at. And really like great comedy routine related to this. I love how she's talking about some of the side effects of medication, the stigma of medication, and just all of that stuff. And I think, you know, some of those mentalities too, I imagine a lot of people, like I know my partner's family, very like conservative, Catholic, Hispanic, like they don't believe in mental health treatment, right? Like at all. It's like, I would never go to a therapist. I would never seek help for depression. Totally that mentality of like, well, just eat some peanut butter and get over it, have some protein. And so I thought that was kind of a cool connection, but the whole routine, like it's all about her mental health, specifically depression and bipolar disorder, very connected to what we were talking about last time. So with that, we'll move on, but one other thing here. So we talked about a lot of physical culprits with depression, but the cognitive ones are a big one as well. Right. And really famous cognitive psychologist for depression, his name is Aaron Beck. Aaron Beck developed what he called the Beck Depression Inventory, or the BDI. If you've ever been to therapy for depression, you've probably filled out the Beck Depression Inventory at some point. It's a very commonly used tool to assess somebody's levels of depression and if it's changing at all due to treatment. But he talked about something he termed the cognitive triad, that if people have 3 different forms of negative thinking patterns, that it would lead to being depressed. And a lot of his ideas here are related to these like automatic thoughts that we have. When people are depressed, they tend to have very negative automatic thoughts. Everything kind of comes back to something negative, often related to your self-worth and so on. But he said if you have a negative view of yourself, a negative view of the world and your experiences, and a negative view of the future, that you're very likely to struggle with depression, that they kind of lead you into this cycle that goes round and round and round. And it's very common for us to have like some degree of negative thoughts. Everyone has them, but someone who has depression is probably experiencing this to a much more severe degree. And what happens is every little thing that you do becomes global when you have these 3 different types of negative thoughts. So for example, let's say you fail an exam in a class. Okay. Hopefully that hasn't happened to you, but not doing the best on an exam is something most of us experience at some point for a variety of reasons. But let's say you fail an exam. Somebody who has this triad said, like, I knew I would never pass this exam. My teacher probably thinks I'm stupid. My classmates think I'm stupid. My parents think I'm stupid. And then it just snowballs into like this huge thing, right? So I'm never going to pass this class, right? And if I don't pass this class, then I'm never going to get my degree. I'm never going to be able to transfer. And if I can't transfer, then I'll never get the job that I want. I'll never have enough money to do the things I want in life. I'm never going to find anyone who's going to marry me. I might as well die now because I'm going to be alone. Right? From one thing, it just spirals out of control. And so a lot of his focus was on trying to rein it in. Okay, like, yeah, you might fail the class, or you might not get the grade you want in the class, but that doesn't mean your whole life is over. Right? But typically someone with depression take something very small and then globalize it. And very black and white thinking is common when you're depressed, like all or nothing, instead of like seeing the kind of gray middle ground in the middle. Yeah.
Or, so you have that all 3.
According to him, like,
Then how would a narcissist be depressed? Because the view of their self is very high.
yeah.
they can just view the world and future as like shit.
So interestingly, with narcissism, I mean, and it can go multiple ways, right? But oftentimes narcissism is very much like a cover up for feeling incredibly insecure. So people project being like full of themselves and narcissistic to cover up for the fact that they feel very inferior and worthless. Not always, but it can sometimes manifest that way. Someone who is like truly a narcissist and like doesn't feel that inferiority might not be depressed. And again, this is one side of the coin. So you don't have to have this to be depressed. But according to Beck, from a cognitive perspective, that would be the big contributor. So it could be completely biological for someone and they don't have this. Or it could be this and there's no biology. It could be a little bit of both. But narcissism is interesting in that way. It's often like a projection, like almost a superiority complex to cover up inferiority. Yeah.
I discussed in like previous psychology level, but you're saying narcissism is like always showing yourself, always making things about you. So it's people brought up like social media nowadays. Most people, their entire page is just pictures of them and their life. And they brought up it's possible a lot of celebrities or a lot of social media personalities, influencers are narcissistic. When you have to say, what's your like opinion, personal opinion on that? Seeing how social media has changed mental.
Yeah, I mean, social media is tricky because it's all kind of like everything, it's such a distorted, like I just think of TikTok, for example, right? Like how different everybody's TikTok algorithm is. Like things get kind of ended up being very catered toward you depending on what you like or don't like, or what you like hard or don't hard or scroll through. It's media contributes to so many things with mental health, right? And that's something that's talked about a lot, that people feel very inferior, they don't feel good enough, they're constantly comparing themselves to other people in a way that they might not have without social media, which is one of the reasons it's, you know, encouraged for you to not let kids like access it too early, because it gives them access to everything, right? So, I mean, I think it can be helpful and harmful. It can lead to a sense of connection and community, but it can also lead to bullying and feeling othered. It is really just kind of all over the place. But social media has been shown to correlate with, you know, people struggling with their view of themselves, whether that inflates it or deflates it, if that makes sense. Anything else for now? Yeah, sorry, I didn't hear you. I mean, narcissism is more like an inflated sense of self-worth, right? Which tends to not be present when people are depressed. For the most part, people tend to feel very worthless when they're depressed. But being very consumed with your own reality is definitely common, though that may or may not correlate to narcissism, right? So there's usually that exaggerated, like, think of like having a big head. You feel like you're the most worthwhile person ever, which doesn't tend to be common. So, but that like everything's about me can very much be here because you're very caught up in your head, right? You kind of overthink everything sometimes when you're in this state. But there was so the other side of this coin is bipolar disorder, and that's what we'll spend some time going over from here. So remember that in the past, we used to call bipolar disorder manic depression. Makes sense. You have mania and depression, right? So manic depression. But we coined two different types of mania. So there's mania, and then there's hypomania. And when people have hypomania, it's almost like mania light, right? Like you have manic episodes, but they're not as damaging. They're not as, they don't interfere quite as much, right? But people can have mania or hypomania, and that dictates which type of bipolar disorder you end up having. So with this disorder, people have alternating periods of manic episodes or hypomanic episodes and depression, oftentimes with normal mood in between. Now, some people tend to gravitate more toward like the ups and some people more toward the downs. It can be kind of like all over the place in terms of how it presents. But there's often a lot of normal mood in between. People kind of do this pattern of like up and down and up and down and up and down. And everything kind of in the middle would be more like typical normal mood. And there's lots of medications we'll talk about to help with this. But with this disorder, a lot of very common like kind of stereotypes of this, right? If you've ever seen somebody like laugh and then cry, like every time I've seen somebody do that, someone I know has been like, oh my gosh, you're so bipolar, right? Like this isn't a very quick thing, like that. This tends to be long lasting, like mood shifts. Remember that depression you have to have for at least 2 weeks, and mania has to be at least 5 days, right? So these are longer lasting, like mood changes. It's not rapid like we tend to think of it. So what we see with this is normal periods of mood followed by either highs or lows. Even one manic episode would qualify you to have bipolar disorder. So even if you normally have depression, one manic episode alone would be enough. So let's look at some of the criteria of mania, or like a manic episode. So in order to have a manic episode, you have to have 3 or more, so 3+ symptoms. And they have to last for at least a week. Sometimes we say 5 days, but the technical criteria is at least a week. And some of the things that people experience, right? They have an inflated sense of self-esteem, which by itself doesn't sound so bad, right? Like you have high self-esteem, but it's very like grandiose. Like this would border on like narcissistic, maybe, right? Like you think you are so important, you can do anything. It's sometimes called grandiosity. Like people have these delusions of being able to accomplish anything when they might not have any support to believe that they can actually do that. So I'll put that here as well. Sometimes we call that grandiosity. Grandiose ideas, right? So your head gets very inflated. It's often not grounded in reality. I'm going to open that business that I've always wanted to do, even though you have no like money to do it, no experience with it. It's very like big inflated ideas. Oftentimes you have a decreased need for sleep. Oftentimes when people are in a manic episode, they hardly sleep at all, right? It might be that you get only a couple of hours. You're so keyed up that you have a hard time sleeping, right? People very rarely get a good night of sleep when they're in a manic episode because they're so up and agitated. You have a pressure to keep talking. So pressure to talking, sometimes like rapid speech. Sometimes it's almost like people can't stop. They're just talking a million miles a minute. It's very quick, very pressured. They're often interrupting other people because they can't control their own level of speech. You have a flight of ideas. So your thoughts and ideas are kind of all over the place, right? Like racing thoughts, you're jumping from one thing to another, kind of loose associations between the thoughts in your mind. You're really distracted. So oftentimes it's very challenging to focus. A couple other things you have, this is probably the biggest one. You have an excessive involvement in pleasurable activities. So we'll say involvement in pleasurable activities. With a high potential for dangerous consequences. So people tend to do things that get themselves into trouble. They go out and spend a bunch of money that they don't have. They go out and have unprotected sex with a bunch of people. They go out and use drugs, right? They go out and do things that have a high potential for consequences, right? And oftentimes when people cycle out of a manic episode, oh my God, I spent all this money and now I'm in debt. How can I return those things? What do I do? I went into this, where there's often like very like risky, kind of impulsive, reckless behavior that you see within a manic episode. One more thing, and I'll put it down here, psychomotor agitation. Kind of similar to you would see like with ADHD, people fidget, they tap, they're restless, they're kind of pacing. It's like you have too much energy and you don't know what to do with it. It's a very up and agitated state, almost like you're on a substance, like a stimulant that has really put you in an up spot where you can't sleep, can't focus, and you're kind of all over the place. Yeah.
So, yeah, I know the stereotype is that there's really high highs and really low lows. Is there not really low lows with bipolar disorder, or is it just like a period of mania and then it goes back to normal level?
So typically, so in order to have it, you have to have had a depressive episode and you have to have had a manic episode. So sometimes, yeah, so typically what happens is after a high, people go to the low. And that's just very common with our chemistry, that if you have a really intense up, you tend to dip.
It's like matching potential.
Yeah, right, in a way, right? It's like that period where it's rebuilding and getting ready to like send another signal, right? Same thing with anything. If you're really up and agitated, there tends to be a fallout afterward. Same if you use like a stimulant, right? You get way up and then you dip afterward. That's really common with this disorder. Some people spend more time in the ups and some people more time in the downs. That part's kind of all over the place, but it's really common that people are here and then they dip and then they might have months in the middle, right? And then something could trigger a manic episode or a depressed episode. Other thoughts or comments, stories, questions? Yeah. Yeah.
But we would see him sometimes, and afterwards, my parents were always like, I swear he does coke, like,
Yeah.
I actually believe that, like, he was just, it was just like too much abnormal behavior,
Yeah.
like, my parents were like so sure that it was due to something else,
Mm-hmm.
but now it like, it makes a lot of sense for everybody.
Yeah.
Not just him, like, all of us, like, whoa.
Yeah, and it can look like that. It can look like someone is on like an illicit, like on a drug, because they're so up and agitated. We're like, whoa, what's going on, right? My mom has bipolar disorder. So I grew up with a mom who was like, which mom am I gonna get today, right? And it was always so challenging for me, because some days she'd be so up, let's do everything like, ah, like crazy up, and then she wouldn't get out of bed for 2 weeks, right? And so it was like, which mom, right? And when she was up, it was like, whoa, what is wrong with you? Because it was shocking. Right, to visit us last year, it was last year, it was around Christmas time. And she had a manic episode while she was with us, and my partner, who like does not believe in mental health, anything, was like, whoa. That was a manic episode, wasn't it? I was like, see, it's real, right? Like she like doesn't tend to believe in it like I do. But my mom was like running around the house, like she was literally like pacing everywhere and like talking a million miles a minute, and I was like, Mom, calm down. Like, what did you take? Calm down. But it can look like that sometimes when people are in that state. It's so off, especially if they've been low. The contrast is intense. Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna have another like on the spot, put you on the spot question. What's your like view in terms of like somebody like Kanye West who's been thrust into the Slumber Five because of this disorder?
Yeah.
And like, where do we draw the line between this is somebody who's doing a really serious mental disorder and needs help versus this person spreading, you know, really bad Nazi rhetoric and hate speech, and how
Yeah.
like it's so hard to draw the line. So I guess that's
Yeah, and like, just because you're in a manic episode doesn't excuse your behavior, right?
Right.
Like, so I think there's a level of understanding that can come with, okay, this person has bipolar disorder and they're in a manic episode. That can help you to understand where it's coming from.
Right.
But the idea of like, well, I'm immune because I have bipolar disorder, like I wouldn't agree with,
Yeah.
right? Your actions are still your own. And so I think that's where understanding is helpful, but just because you understand something doesn't mean it's always enough to stop it or control it. Right, and there are a lot of people who in these states, the consequences of their actions can be devastating in a manic episode. And then they cycle out of it and it's like, oh, oops, yeah, like you don't have a lot of control,
right.
but that doesn't excuse you. I mean, in my opinion, right? Was that a, yeah?
One like medication that would say that it's okay with bipolar.
So a lot of medications for bipolar, like, and kind of like she was saying in her skit, medications often have multiple, like, implications for them, multiple uses. So it might be that you're on something that's typically used for bipolar, but you have depression, right? But maybe you respond to it. Like a lot of people respond to medications that maybe aren't like the primary indication for their disorder. So it could be that they suspect bipolar, or it could just be that was the right medication to help you. Right, or not, right, so it doesn't necessarily mean that you have bipolar. It's tricky. SSRIs and SNRIs are used for depression and bipolar and anxiety. Like the implications are so many, right? I was talking with somebody who was prescribed, this past student who was prescribed gabapentin for sleep. And gabapentin is also something that we use for anxiety panic attacks. And she's all like, so do I have anxiety and panic attacks, or is it for sleep? And like, well, what did you eat it for? Sleep. So the primary indication is sleep. So it's oftentimes, it can be confusing though, but I wouldn't say it necessarily has to mean something.
Something I learned, I was watching this, documentary or docuseries on Disney, and there's a famous photographer, Dan Winters, that is bipolar, and it was really interesting to listen to how not only himself, but how his family, you know, like his wife and his son
Yeah.
have had to deal with those ups and downs, and how it's affected his art, and how sometimes it's brought out some of the best
Yeah.
art that he's ever produced. But it was just really interesting to see not only their perspective, but then his perspective, you know, and dealing with it and managing it.
Yeah.
It's not easy at
No.
all.
And it's probably, there are a couple of disorders that have a lot of stigma. This is one of them,
One of them,
right?
yeah.
This one has a lot of stigma attached to it. And a lot of stereotypes and like negative views. It tends to be viewed as a more severe. So does borderline personality, which we'll get to in the personality disorders unit. So there's a lot of disorders that have that level to it, and this is one of them. And so we'll get there in a minute, but if people are able to harness their manic behavior, then they probably have hypomania. Because mania is very difficult to control. I won't say impossible, but difficult. But hypomania, a lot of artists who have hypomania have been able to create and use that energy to really make a lot from it. Hypomania can actually be somewhat productive if you can manage it.
Know how to, like,
Yeah,
harness
and
it.
that's bipolar 2. So if you have manic episodes, you have bipolar 1. And if you have hypomanic episodes, you have bipolar 2, less severe. And so people with bipolar 2, if you can use that energy, you might be wildly productive. It's all of this, but less. So you have elevated self-esteem and you're not sleeping as much and you're moving quicker. Maybe you can use that.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
but if you're able to do that, then you're here.
Okay,
Right.
that makes sense.
Yeah.
And his work is, absolutely amazing,
Yeah.
breathtaking, and he's worked with some of the biggest movie stars and
Mhm.
does fabulous, you know, pieces.
Mhm.
And you would never know looking at the pieces, but then when you find out, you're like, but yet the pieces make sense when
Yeah.
you see that, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's just really interesting to hear the perspectives, and the son feels like he really missed out a lot on having a father,
Mhm.
because it would kind of, when he would get wrapped up in that time where he was creating and probably the hypomania, he was really not a father in a way, you know, he was very much about himself and his work,
Yeah.
which would be very hard to.
Which is some of this stuff,
Yeah,
right? Where it
exactly,
becomes all about
exactly.
you.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, a lot of people have been able to like harness that in some way, right? A lot of very famous like artists have had bipolar disorder. And what we would probably now call bipolar 2.
Okay.
Yeah, I think you're.
Yeah, I have a really good friend who suffers from bipolar disorder, and he's like almost like he's formed a cocaine addiction. It brought like her point five.
Mhm.
He formed like a severe cocaine addiction because he missed his night. So but
Interesting.
he like he worked like over like 120 hours a week. Like he wouldn't go home.
Yeah.
Like he would sleep because like he worked in a studio. So he would just like sleep, crash out on a couch, and then like he like formed a cocaine addiction because he missed
the ups.
productivity
Mm,
of it, and it like he still deals with it.
yeah.
But and it's just like that's like another level of it that I like forgot about. But imagine like the amount of people who are like prescribing,
Self-medicating, yeah,
medicating,
yeah.
It's like it's a lot. But yeah, it's a really fun picture
Yeah.
because of things bipolar.
Mhm.
And
And
he
then you
doesn't
get the
wanna be like
combination, right?
Because
Yeah.
he's like addicted to his those things. So
Interesting.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the manic episodes, you're so up, but it can feel very much like a substance, and you
Yeah.
can induce a manic episode through a substance as well, though technically that'd be a substance disorder, not a depressive disorder. Is there another? Yeah.
Mania, like hypo means more, but hypomania here means like mild.
Hypo means, yeah,
that's what it
hyper means more, hypo
Oh,
means
thank
like,
you.
I confusing, right? They're both like you instantly
I'm
thinking
mixing
that.
up words.
No, it's okay, hyper,
Okay.
it would be up and hypo less, right? And so it's like mania, like on a lesser degree. So it's all these things, but on a less devastating level.
So
If
that
that
means
makes
you
sense.
take lower doses of medication?
Maybe you don't need as much medication. Yeah, that's possible. You had your hand up. Yeah. Yeah, so there isn't really like just a manic disorder, like where people only have mania. So, and I think, I can't remember if maybe we were talking about this or not, but in every single category, there's an NOS, not otherwise specified. So what that means is you have, so you clearly have a mood disorder, but it doesn't fit something perfect. So there's a lot of diagnoses of NOS. So like anxiety disorder, not otherwise specified, mood disorder, not otherwise specified, which means you have something in this realm, but it doesn't fit the criteria cleanly for a disorder, like specifically. So it could be that someone's only having manic episodes. They would probably have mood disorder like NOS. And there's one of those in every category just to capture people who don't neatly fit into a diagnosis. So I have an example of this. If you've ever seen Silver Linings Playbook, a character in there with bipolar disorder, he tends to have a lot of like anger as part of his manic episodes, which sometimes is the case, sometimes not. But a little scene showing like an example of a manic episode, potential for consequences. So that movie, you see somebody with bipolar who has very like struggles with anger outbursts, which can sometimes be the case, but it's often that like very up kind of reckless, impulsive sort of behavior. Cyclothymic disorder, if you remember, we had dysthymic disorder, which is someone who has like low-grade depression for 2 years. This is someone who has low-grade mania and low-grade depression for 2 years. So somebody who instead of like this pattern here is, I lost my pen. That's in my pocket. Like I have too many pockets, I can't find my pen. All right, so someone here, it's more like this. Right, so it's not as pronounced, right? So they have lower highs and higher lows. So they're kind of more in the middle, but it lasts for a longer period of time. So we kind of have 3 different presentations of bipolar. Bipolar 1, which is the most severe, full-blown mania, full-blown depression. Bipolar 2, full-blown depression and hypomania, so a little like easier to manage the manic side. And then cyclothymic, which is kind of lower levels of both, but lasting much, much longer. This one is missed a lot. Very easy to miss it because it's not as pronounced. Yeah, so I mean, it can often, what you often see is it tends to start in like the teen years for a lot of people. When hormones are a little bit out of control, it can kind of exacerbate things that are already there. But typically, we try not to diagnose a lot of disorders until people are over 18. Just because you're still kind of, you know, everything's still kind of evening out. You have a lot of other pressures that are normal in that time. So I would say like in the 18 to 22 range is where you tend to see a lot of diagnoses of it. But you might see it start to manifest like 16, 17 is relatively common as well. But like 18 to 22, I would say, because we typically wait till you're over 18 for a lot of disorders. Not always, but typically.
What if this goes untreated, let's say, like somebody's now in their 30s, 40s.
Yeah.
They don't really get any medical help, they don't see anybody, but they know their behavior is on. What would happen, when you say, would it get worse over time or just stay the same and this person just has to live with this?
Yeah, it can go either way. Some people outgrow disorders. It's like your chemistry balances itself out and you know, you kind of outgrow it. A lot of people learn to live with disorders without any kind of treatment, right? So they learn to manage it the best they can. They learn to recognize when they're cycling one way or the other. And some people it gets worse, right? Sometimes with age, things can get worse as well. And it can be life events that make it worse or better, right? Maybe you meet somebody who kind of helps mellow you out and balance you, or you meet somebody who pushes you further into it, right? It can go either way. So it's kind of all over the place. No, it's not the most satisfying answer, but it can go in any of those directions.
I was reading a really interesting study.
Okay.
It was saying that for a long time, people thought of bipolar as like, it just gets worse. Pretty much. And thought that's what people did for a long time, but this new study was saying that potentially up to like 25% of cases.
Yeah. That you could just kind of figure it out and have it go away, right? That happens with disorders. We don't tend to talk about that, but it can totally happen. When we get to schizophrenia, you see something like that very similarly, where about 25% of people, it just never escalates, or it just kind of goes away. And then you have about 50% that stay active and 25% that just kind of like go back and forth between levels of functioning. But that can happen with this, that people sort of just mellow out over time. And is that they outgrew it, or did they just get better at coping with it, or at handling it? And that's where it gets tricky to know, which is the case, but that can happen. Yeah.
Also with diagnosis, sense of like, she shows signs of like almost everything that we've talked about.
Okay.
But then you throw in like, disabilities that she's, was born with, and then you throw in, drug use.
Yeah.
So how do you navigate someone like that?
Yeah.
Because I'm sure that happens, you know what I'm saying? Not everybody,
Right.
fits in all these little safe.
They don't.
Yeah.
And
So
oftentimes people use drugs to cope with
exactly.
really common, right?
Exactly.
So if there are substances in play, oftentimes the first course of action is to eliminate the substance.
Okay.
So like, let's say that someone with bipolar disorder and they're using substances as well. We might try to get them off of the substances and then see where are we at without those.
Okay.
Right, so it's often a process of like trying to weed out one thing after another to get to the core of what's actually going on. The substances can easily exacerbate anyone's illness, right? They can push it in any direction. And what if the mania or the depression is the result of a substance, right? And so we have to eliminate the substance to know that. And sometimes eliminating the substance doesn't get rid of it because substance can cause long-term things for people, right? Especially like manic episodes from somebody who's abused stimulants of some kind. So yeah, it's often a process of like elimination, of trying to, let's get it down to what we can identify and go from there. And then we can add or subtract still.
And then it's difficult too when they're not willing to, so let's say they're clean,
Yeah.
sober, but yet they're not willing to take medication to treat the actual
Sure.
issues. So my fear is that it's my sister, that she'll always end up going back to drug use again,
Yeah.
So then everybody kind of walks on eggshells going, well, we don't want to send her back to that, but then I'm to the point where like, no, I'm done with that because it's tiresome
Mhm.
for a family to live like that.
Sure.
She needs to finish, her treatment in a sense, she needs to stop. Mom needs to stop enabling her is the bottom line is what really needs to stop
Sure.
happening, but it's like, it's so frustrating.
Yeah.
It really is, and you don't wanna, I love her, but it's a lot to deal with.
Mhm. And it reminds me of Taylor, right? Like you gotta use those arm floaties, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Because it's not okay to drown somebody else
Right,
when you can't swim, right? And that analogy of, other people are there to support you, but you also have to take that responsibility as well. And it's tricky, right?
Yeah.
The balance of enabling versus helping and figuring out what mental health can be very complicated.
yeah,
And then you add like somebody who's enabling it, it can only make it worse. So it can be a lot of balance in that, of like trying to figure out what's what, how do we help this person? How do we encourage them to get treatment if they're resistant to it and all that kind of stuff. It's tricky for sure. So some causes similar to depression, right? Because there's a lot of overlap here. Neurotransmitters, so serotonin and norepinephrine are big culprits with bipolar disorder. So what we see is overactivity or low activity of serotonin, right? So if you flood someone with too much serotonin, you could cause a manic episode. So that's why we have to be really careful, like you were asking earlier about serotonin. Right? So we see that neurotransmitters, a lot of the same ones play a role. And then we add an interesting other element of ion activity. So if you remember, when neurons communicate with each other, right? If I draw like the middle of a neuron, pivotal dendrites, right? We have these ions just inside and outside of a neuron. And ions have an electrical charge to them, and there would be the end of the neuron. My beautiful neuron. I am so jealous of my artistic abilities, but right, they have these little ions here. And when cells fire, when neurons fire, these switch with each other in a process called depolarization, and it causes a change in the electrical composition of a neuron. It's thought with bipolar disorder that there's something going on with the way that neurons are firing, right? That they either fire too easily or too stubbornly. And so we come back to this when it comes to one of the leading treatments for bipolar disorder, right? So this is one kind of interesting element that we add to just depression, that maybe something about the ion transportation and communication is off. And we'll come back to this in a minute when we talk about how we can treat this disorder. There's also a couple of brain structures that have been shown to be a little bit off, whether that's correlation or causation, we still don't know. And then there's some genetic factors, just like with depression, we see about like a 27% likelihood that people will inherit this from a parent. So again, if we think about ion activity, one of the leading ways of treating bipolar disorder is with a medication called lithium. Lithium is a naturally occurring mineral salt, right? If you've taken a science class and studied the periodic table of elements, it's on there, right? Li, lithium, right? Lithium is basically a salt. Salt and sodium affect the way that your ions communicate with each other. So lithium is thought to do something to disrupt this like imbalance here and help people with bipolar disorder. Now it's much more effective at treating mania than it is at treating depression. So it's very common that people will take something like lithium or a different mood stabilizer, and then also an antidepressant to keep the depressive part up as well, right? So lithium, really, really common. It's a mood stabilizing drug. It takes the highs and brings them down, and takes the lows and brings them up. So people are kind of more in the middle. Yeah. 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 Yeah, you would. Yeah, so oftentimes people take them on a steady level because they take a long time to build up to the right concentration in your body. And so if you were to go off of them, sometimes what people do is they titrate it. So they will take like a steady amount, and then when they get into a manic episode, you go up in one medication or you go down in one medication. That's really common, that people maybe at different times of the month or different parts of that cycle will increase or decrease, but you still stay on both in order to keep you relatively steady. Lithium is actually really dangerous if not monitored. So when you take lithium, you actually have to go in for weekly blood tests to make sure you don't have too much of it in your system. If you have too much lithium in your system, it can cause seizures, Parkinsonian like tremors, which we call akathisia, right? Where you just kind of shake and tremor all the time. It can be toxic if you have too much. So when people are on lithium, they often go in for regular blood tests just to make sure that everything is at like an even level. But this would be a mood stabilizing drug, relatively effective for mania. And so often, again, an antidepressant would be prescribed as well. People go to therapy, obviously, to help with this, learn coping skills like those tip skills and cognitive behavioral skills and so on. But typically, if people have severe bipolar 1, they often need medication or some kind of other treatment beyond therapy. Maybe not bipolar 2. Bipolar 2, people can manage a little better, but bipolar 1 tends to be very impactful and often requires some kind of medical like treatment, medication. Lots of songs written about lithium. I want to play one for you. The Nirvana song, not the best in terms of like connection to the actual drug, but the Evanescence song is very telling, I think, of this drug. And so I'll play the song for you, and the video is really like visually depictive, I think, as well, like really like powerful in that way. But listen to the lyrics, the way she's singing the song. If you interpret it as she's singing the whole song about the drug lithium, I think it takes a really interesting meaning. And it's a very common complaint that people have with this drug, that it makes them feel very numb. Because if you bring everything into the middle, right, you've kind of lost that emotional variance that can make you feel alive. right? And so oftentimes people talk about feeling numb or like a zombie when they're on medications like this. So let me play the song for you and then we can see if you have any thoughts afterward. Pause this, them feel better, but it kind of mutes them at the same time. And that's a really common like issue that people have, that it makes them feel like not like themselves. And so she has like a few things she says in there, right? Of like I don't want to forget how I feel without it, but like she wants the drug, but she hates the drug, kind of this love-hate relationship with it. Like, I forgive you after all for the way you make me feel. I appreciate you, but I hate you, right? In a way. And that's really common with these medications. They can make people feel like you've almost lost some of your personality, right? Because instead of having the ups and downs that define you, now you're flat and you're numb, right? But you're not struggling at the same time. So it's a really common like struggle that people have with these mood stabilizers. They're effective, but they can cause changes that people don't always love either. Any like thoughts or comments? Yeah. How do you? Yeah, I mean, the hard part is I think it's a lot of like reminding of like, well, the highs and lows were kind of torturing you, right? So learning to appreciate the numbness in a way, or like maybe the dose is too high. Sometimes that's another thing too, is like if we bring the dose down, then you have a little bit more variability in your mood. Like where's the like the perfect spot where you can tolerate the ups and downs, but you don't feel numb. And that would kind of be the therapeutic goal, is to find that middle ground. But I mean, it's a trade-off, right? Like people who are really struggling with bipolar disorder are often very suicidal, often getting themselves into trouble. So learning to recognize and appreciate the numbness, but have it not be so severe that you lose sight of yourself. It's a balancing act. Any other like thoughts, comments, questions, stories, anything else here for now? All right. Yep, I think that's the last slide there with that. So where we'll go from here, and again, please don't forget to review chapter 7, right, on suicidality, since we won't be covering it. But where we go from here is chapter 9, right? Because we already covered 8, and we covered 7 through suicidality. So chapter 9 is on eating disorders. So we'll stop here because we have 5 minutes left rather than start with like one slide. But on Wednesday, we'll start eating disorders. And then spring break next week, right? So hopefully I'll see you all on Wednesday. Have a great rest of the day.